So as most of you will know, the International Development Section, the IDS, has quite broad remit looking at the intersection of statistics and international development. So this also includes global efforts against illicit financial flows, whether that be money laundering or corruption. So last year we held a discussion with UNODC and various countries on recent efforts to measure illicit financial flows, which is an important requirement to kind of track progress against Sustainable Development Goal 16. Today's discussion is not as much about measuring the scale of the problem, but rather on how statistics and data can help tackle one specific type of financial crime, namely corruption in the context of public procurement. And to get the discussion started, I'm very pleased to welcome our three speakers for today's webinar. First, we will hear from Mihaly Fazekas, who is an associate professor at the Central European University and the scientific director at the Government Transparency Institute. Mihaly will be talking about different dimensions of data scope and accuracy that are critical to efforts to use statistics in the context of public procurement. Then we will hear from Umbek Alakulov, who is a senior data support manager at the Open Contracting Partnership. He'll be talking to us about how the Open Contracting Partnerships helps governments improve data quality, and then give also examples of how that data has been used. And last but not least, we will hear from Charity Kumujuruizi, monitoring and evaluation coordinator at the Africa Freedom of Information Center, who will be talking about the work of this center in the area of public procurement, as well as a specific case study from Uganda. So without further ado, I would like to now give the floor to you, Michi, for our first presentation. Michi, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks a lot, Olivier. Everyone can see my slides and hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so as Olivier introduced, data statistics, data science methods have a great promise to tackle corruption and various other crimes in general, but also in particular in public procurement. So I will talk about the foundations. What kind of data are we talking about? What kind of qualities of that data which we can use to measure corruption, track progress in anti-corruption, so on and so forth. So first, why it matters, and then a little bit about context, because I assume many of you are not public procurement specialists, which is a very rare breed. So it's good that we get on the same page in terms of basics. And then I will get into data quality dimensions. So why is it important? So one straightforward argument is that public procurement matters a lot because it's big. It's big in terms of covering about 1/3 of government spending. So that's now OECD figures here. And it's not just big in terms of public spending, but it's by far the largest discretionary spending area. Okay, so discretion is very important if you want to get corrupt money to your cronies, because XYZ person is running a government or a municipality. You need money which you can change, which you can target, which you can channel. Of course, it's possible to corrupt pensions, unemployment benefits, but it's the amount of discretion is much lower there, so it's much harder to corrupt it. Whereas a highway or a big consultancy contract is to a large degree down to the choices of the public officials in terms of the exact project scope, the exact conditions, the values, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of choices to be made which can be corrupted, right? So a large amount of money, and to a large degree it is discretionary. Okay, so I think these are two big reasons why we should care about public procurement and should be worried about corruption in public procurement. So if you want to understand a little bit more of what we mean by public procurement, we first have to understand the cycle or the process of procurement in conceptually at least. So it starts from planning. You want to build a highway in this and this between these and these cities. Then it has to be advertised so that companies submit their bids. Then they have to be selected, evaluated, and eventually a contract has to be awarded to the winning supplier and the winning bidder, and then that contract has to be managed. Now, in reality, we have usually a lot less data of this process. So we have the middle of it. So the advertisement, the call for tenders notice, then an award decision, the contract award notice, and some information on contract implementation, but that usually tends to be very patchy. So we know if there was an amendment or if the contract concluded, but we don't know really what's happening inside of this. Either way, and I'm sure the next speaker, Umrebek, will talk a lot more about this. Either way, typically this is a data-rich area of these steps of the procurement process. We tend to have a lot of variables which are useful for fighting corruption and measuring corruption. So you can look at the buyers and the bidders, so the actors, then the tender or contract, so what the transaction between these two actors, and a lot of procedural information, dates, contract values, product codes, locations of, say, contract implementation. So these information are available in government announcements or public procurement data sets. And then these can be turned into measurement of corruption risks and other conflict of interest and others. So one example you could think of is when you take a competitive market. So we know there are a bunch of companies which operate on that market, so could bid for a particular tender, but only one company shows up, right? So that suggests that there was some sort of limitation on competition. And if you couple this with some sort of procedural deviance or anomaly, you can think about an expectation of publishing a call for tenders, but the information was not in the announcement, or the terms for the tender were excessively restrictive, and as a result you get a very little competition, in extreme case only one bid on a competitive market. So you could think about a bunch of ways to use these indicators to create, use these data points to create corruption risk indicators. Now, the data, and then many of the next slides I will report on, come from what the Government Transparency Institute collects from. So that's more than 50 countries, more than 130 million contracts covering large parts of the world, arguably with a heavy focus on middle and high income countries where governments produce these sorts of data sets to start with. But nevertheless, there are quite a few countries where we collect data from, and Charity will talk about probably Uganda. So this is some place where we have been collecting data, among others, in collaboration with Africa. So data quality. So what do we mean by data quality? We mean four things when we talk about data quality. The first is the scope of the data set. It's a range of transactions which are in the publicly available data sets compared to the set of transactions which really happened, right? So what scope of actual public procurement transactions are covered by the data set. The depth of information is how much information we know about each disclosed contract or tender, right? So you can think about scope as a number of rows in the database, and depth the number of columns if you think in a two-dimensional tabular data set. Now, accuracy is a tricky one and has a lot of things, and I'm sure the statisticians in this call know this better than I do. We generally tend to think about accuracy when we try to estimate the correspondence between the published information, the data points, and the actual behavior. So if we have a contract value in a database, does it correspond to the actual contract value in a signed contract? Or if there is no contract value, so missing information in the database, then what does it mean for the actual contract signed? Most likely there was a contract value, it's just the data we have is imperfect. And then finally we have access, so how easy, reliable it is to use and access public procurement data, is an API, a data dump, what have you. So a few examples of what sort of diversity and variability we have along these 4 dimensions. So first, data scope. These are reporting thresholds across Europe. Reporting thresholds are very important for public procurement data sets and regulations. So these are the minimum contract values above which a set of transparency and procedural rules apply. So if a contract value is, say, higher than 10,000 euros in Estonia in 2018, that means the contract has to be published on the Estonian National Public Procurement Portal, has to go through a number of safeguards, for example, advertising the call for tenders, allowing the range of bidders to bid, so on and so forth. So what you see here is that some countries, like Austria or Germany, they have very high reporting threshold, so they tend to be intransparent, tend to have relatively low quality public procurement data sets, like limited scope public procurement data sets. Whereas countries like Spain, France, or even going Armenia and Georgia, the reporting thresholds are low. So we have a lot of data in the procurement data sets, and this also means that a large part of the total universe of procurement transactions are actually captured by our data sets. Now, data depth is the second dimension. One key field which is often missing, and it's very important for understanding what's happening on public procurement markets, is organization IDs. So public procurement at the basis, it's a transaction between a buyer, typically a public organization, and the supplier, typically a private sector organization, and these two contract with each other. Now, the data only makes sense if you can observe organizations over time when they repeatedly interact with each other. For this, you need organization IDs, unique, reliable organization IDs. Now, what you have in big parts of European public procurement data sets like France, the UK, Germany, Poland, is that we have the name, someone typed up an organization name and an address, again, someone typed up an organization address, but we don't have a unique ID and we don't have a fixed list for checking whether these organizations really exist or the names were mistyped, so on and so forth. So the problem here from data quality perspective is that some key fields are present, but they don't tell you what you really need to know is who is this organization? What's the ID? I want to follow this organization over time, but if someone writes the names or some people write the organization names differently or imperfectly over time, then it becomes very challenging, right? Someone says Siemens won the contract. Well, that's great, but Siemens tends to trade under a bunch of names, even in a place like Germany or Romania. So you would really want to know, is it Siemens Healthcare, Siemens Energy, so on and so forth. It's not possible if the name is just typed up and is imprecise. Now, data accuracy, so share of missing information fields, is a very simple check on data quality. So here we took an EU-wide data portal, what is called TED, Tenders Electronic Daily, and that's data which is regulated uniformly across the EU with EU directives. So this data which appears in this portal, and it foresees a number of mandatory fields like the buyer name, the tender price, some information on the bidder like name and address. So these mandatory fields should be in there, but instead a large part of these mandatory fields are empty. So it's a very basic check that the data cannot be correct because there's always a buyer, right? If you don't know the buyer's name, that it's a data error, not because no one bought something, right? It absolutely makes no sense. So on average, you have 15% of these fields missing between 2009 and 15, but then you have a place like Sweden, like Finland, like Switzerland, when the data error missing rate varies between 25 and 30%. Now this is varying quite a bit, and it's surprising how some countries jump to the top. More recent years, 2017 and 21, so Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania have 23, 19, 16% missing rates, and then the Sweden and Finland and these countries went down to 6%, 5%. So overall, there was an improvement in data quality, but a big change in country ranking, and some countries deteriorated data quality, some dramatically increased. And finally, data accessibility, which at this point we just equate with machine readability. So the information on a structured format of the data, whether the data set is downloadable, an Excel, JSON, or some other format, or whether the data is semi-structured, so it's in HTML pages, so it can be scraped and parsed, but it's quite hard to be done. And then, of course, we have some cases when the data is neither structured or semi-structured, but some sort of not fully machine-readable format, like scanned, handwritten, signed PDFs, or in some countries like Sweden, there is not even a public database for a big part of the procurement market. Let me thank you for your attention and then stop my presentation and hand it over to the next presenter. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks a lot, Michi. It was very useful and clear background to kind of start the discussion. Were there any kind of questions for clarification at this point? Otherwise, maybe we can move on to Beck. Yeah, right over to you, Beck.
Hello. Do you see my screen, the slides? And you hear me well?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So today I will be speaking to you about how open contracting can help in the fight against corruption. So in the spirit of this event, I will bring in an emphasis on data-driven solutions throughout my presentation. One second. So here's the outline of my presentation. I will first describe the building blocks and concepts making up open contracting for anti-corruption. Next, I will expand on those building blocks. They include open data, data-centered, tools and methodologies, state oversight, and civic monitoring for anti-corruption. So let me start by defining open contracting, because it may be something you've heard, but you may not fully know what it actually means. So it's not just open data is the main message. So open contracting broadly refers to publishing and using open, accessible, and timely information on public contracting to engage stakeholders, and that's an important component, including citizens and businesses, to fix problems and deliver results. So it's very much goal-oriented. The latter part regarding fixing problems can refer to many different types of problems. And for the purposes of this session, I will focus on anti-corruption reforms. I've depicted a very simplified model here on your screen, showing the different components and concepts that make up open contracting, with the final aim of achieving anti-corruption impact. First and foremost, we need open data. Equally importantly, the open data should conform to a standard that is used by as many users as possible. The next building block, shown in an orange circle, refers to tools and methodologies that can be applied to open public procurement data. I'd like to emphasize here that having open data which conforms to a data standard makes it possible to build and reuse tools and methodologies at scale. Finally, the open data and tools are only valuable if they are effectively used by the key stakeholders to prevent corruption. Here, I have chosen to highlight the role of state oversight and civic monitoring in using the available data and tools for anti-corruption impact and reform. But obviously, depending on the context, some other stakeholder groups could be important. Now, let's start unpacking this graph a little bit. I will start with the circles encapsulated in the yellow box there. So an essential component of open contracting is open data. To put it simply, open data is data that can be freely used, reused, redistributed by pretty much anyone without any major obstacles or restrictions. As Michi alluded to in his presentation, it's also important that open data is published in a machine-readable form. Now, when it comes to public procurement, at least, having open data itself is not enough because public procurement processes result in highly complex and fragmented data that is produced, stored, and maintained across multiple government agencies. in different formats sometimes, and used by stakeholders for completely different purposes, right? So, and that, all that, well, when I described the complexity, that is in one country. So you can imagine the difficulties when trying to combine public procurement data from multiple different jurisdictions for research or other purposes. So what we need is a data standard which defines the structure and meaning of data in order to resolve any ambiguity and help interpret the data in a consistent manner. So that's where OCDS comes in. OCDS, or the Open Contracting Data Standard, is a free open data standard for public contracting, implemented now by 59 publishers, some of which are countries, some of which are cities around the world. So some key features of OCDS include that there's a common structured data model, including a schema, code list, and common rules and definitions for the different data fields and variables. There's guidance and tools to support implementation of OCDS, so you're not just left alone. And there's an extension mechanism because I'll continue. So there's also an extension mechanism which allows publishers to add additional key information to on top of the the main OCDS schema. And I'd like to highlight this that there's free global support from the data support team, and I'm part of that team. So if you see on the screen, and it's very similar to what Mishi was showing about the procurement cycle. So an individual contracting process has several different stages, from planning, tendering, awarding, contracting, and implementation. That's at least how we look at it at OCP. So what often happens is the data across these different processes are generated and maintained by different agencies, as I said earlier. So even if you manage to access all these databases, it's usually very difficult to reliably connect the dots and track any particular contracting process from the start to the end. And this is also where OCDS helps, because we bring together the data from the different stages using a single open contracting process, which we call OCIT. One more thing, OCDS also partly helps with challenges that may arise due to different languages, because the standard defines a comprehensive set of procurement concepts, terminology, and data fields for publication that enables users to conduct comparative research between the different countries, and also apply the tools that are developed in one place in a different context. So moving on, where can you access OCDS data? There are many sources. The simplest one is to go to the OCP data registry. That is the last one on this list. And the OCP data registry is the most comprehensive source for researchers and civil society alike, wishing to get started and look at a particular country's procurement data. The data is usually available in JSON, Excel, CSV formats, and we also include a summary of any known data quality issues so that you're not caught by surprise later deep into your analysis. So I will be providing the links afterwards. Having looked at open data and data standardization issues, let's go further along the graph and now focus on tools and methodologies. The OCP team continuously builds, maintains, and updates a number of tools for OCDS data, some of which can be used for anti-corruption research and reform. Given the limited time available to me, I'll only highlight a couple of these resources next. So one of them is the data review tool, which can be useful for both for data publishers and users to check data quality issues. As Mishi pointed out, data quality issues, across scope and depth, are a major hurdle in leveraging statistics for anti-corruption. Let's say you downloaded a data set which is supposed to conform to OCDS, and if you want to generate a quick and relatively comprehensive report of this data structure that you are trying to deal with, or learn about the content, such as how many observations are contained across the different stages of procurement, or get a deeper look at the potential data quality issues, what you can do is simply upload your data here to the data review tool, and you get a report like this. What you see here is only the headline. The full report goes into the details of every issue, right? The next family of tools I'd like to speak to is around red flags for integrity. We have a publication called Red Flags for Integrity, giving the green light to open data solutions. You can see the cover of this publication on the left side. It is a methodology guide which shows how to use open data in public procurement, ideally released in the OCDS format, but not necessarily, to identify corruption risks throughout the procurement process. And the next resource is actually linked to it, the Red Flags for OCDS mapping. It's an accompanying resource to the methodology guide that I just described. And this tool helps to map OCDS data, specifically now, to 73 different red flags. And it contains calculation methods for each red flag and also provides background and empirical literature using the red flags. So spoiler alert here, you will find that many of the red flags originate from the work of Mihail Fazekas, to whom we've had the pleasure of listening earlier. And here's what the red flags to OCDS mapping tool looks like. So it's presented in a spreadsheet format with a number of tabs, and you can see, like for example, in the last column here, which are the columns that you need to be using in order to calculate the specific red flag from OCDS dataset. And that's one of the benefits, as I said, of standardized data. In this final segment of my presentation, I'd like to quickly address the importance of key stakeholders in implementing open contracting to fight corruption in public procurement, especially state oversight and civic monitoring that are vital in this regard. Among others, I'd like to highlight two main reasons for their vital importance in using open contracting for anti-corruption. One, without buy-in from the state and combined with pressure from the civil society, it may not even be possible to get comprehensive data published on public procurement, right? So without data, you can't really move on to its use for any purpose, let alone corruption. The second reason is even if comprehensive data and good quality data, along with robust and data-driven anti-corruption tools exist, a lack of commitment from the state or a weak civil society sector can hamper any anti-corruption efforts. You can easily imagine a scenario where you push for open contracting in a context where there are people in key positions that benefit and collect rents from an opaque public procurement system. Very difficult to move forward. At OCP, we fully appreciate the need for a holistic approach, not just publish your data and it's gonna help fight corruption. In our daily work, we bring together all of the building blocks of open contracting that I've touched upon. We do this by helping partners throughout the 4 stages that you see in this cyclical graph. They include setting clear reform goals and securing buy-in from relevant stakeholders, publishing, using and improving open contracting data, which is the focus here of this event, but also working along with key stakeholders to better enable them to use the published data and monitor public procurement and create that pressure. And measuring the achievement of policy objectives and adapting. And this is the reason we have this cycle, because different countries may have different starting points along this journey. And then it may take several iterations through these stages to achieve the intended outcomes. Couple of examples. Do I have 2 minutes, Olivier?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Quickly
on these examples.
All right, so a couple of examples of how OCP has been supporting partners to achieve anti-corruption objectives. The first one from Italy. So the Italian government, led by its anti-corruption agency called ENAC, has been seeking to rebuild confidence in public contracting. And they closely engage, as I said, with key stakeholders. In this case, it includes public sector experts, academics, and the private sector. And they've opened up this huge database of 60 million contracting procedures, right? And it can be downloaded in various formats. And this slide shows you a screenshot of risk indicators dashboard, which contains 17 red flags and allows users to to filter these by provinces. And they're also publishing their data in OCDS format. And the reason they're doing is, several reasons, but one of them is to include digital systems for tracking cross-border funds, not only in Italy, right? And also to make their data more user-friendly for different stakeholders. And this is their estimate, is that They save about 10 to 20% in the health sector alone through these data-driven approaches. And quickly about the second case, now this one from a different part of the world, Ecuador. Their procurement has been mostly done electronically for a long time, but the data remained largely unstructured and fragmented, right? So there was also ongoing concern about the lack of competition and corruption in public procurement. And they got involved in a program, a Lift Impact Accelerator program that we run annually at OCP. It's a 18-month-long program that helps teams of reformers deliver change through open contracting. And just to jump to some of the impacts that we're seeing, so from 2019 to 2022, open procedures increased by 10%. The average number of bids increased to above 4 from 3.5. And as the program was initially rolled out during the pandemic, open contracting led to 172 legal cases and investigations related to pandemic purchasing through this open contracting initiative. And if you are using OCDS data, we have a very capable team. And if you wish to leverage the power of data and statistics using OCDS data, we'll be happy to support you for free by our team members located across the different time zones and speaking multiple languages. Thank you very much for your attention and time.
Thank you so much, Umbek. And I know that, like all our speakers today, you've got a lot of expertise in this field, and so I feel a bit bad about limiting you in time to 12 minutes, but luckily we'll also have an opportunity to answer any more questions after the next and final presentation. Charity, are you there? The floor is yours, Charity. I will share the screen so that you can talk us through the slides as agreed. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Yes. Over to you, Charity.
My name is Charity Komijlizi. I work with the Africa Freedom of Information Center, which is a civil society. And I'm here to share how we have leveraged on data analytics to fight corruption in Uganda. I would like to talk briefly about AFIC. Africa Freedom of Information Center is a membership organization that works in Africa within 24 countries and has 46 members. In these countries, we promote the right of access to information and anti-corruption. Next, going directly to today's topic is that under our anti-corruption work at AFIC, we're having discussions on how we can solve the big problem that the world has after realizing that most of Africa's procurements are characterized by lack of transparency, inefficiency, lack of basic services. Yet these governments actually spend more than 60% of their annual budgets through public procurement. Next, at that point, Oliver, and then the next slide. At that point, as we're having discussions, we had actually met with OCP, and they had introduced to us open contracting data standards. We used that specific tool and mapped the government's procurement portal. After mapping this procurement portal, we realized that actually data had so many issues. And then we also realized that actually by mapping that portal, we could find leads on how we can find possible ways in which we can actually continue our advocacy against corruption. It was at the same time when we were met with the Global Integrity Group, that together we started discussing these issues around corruption, lack of transparency, lack of integrity, and together we agreed to look at these issues, and then we came up with specific that reports and give feedback back to our governments. So from that discussion, we were able to identify specific indicators, which included indicators on disclosure, an indicator on inclusiveness, an indicator on time overruns, cost overruns, fraud, collusion, and then others, of course, were looking at the general quality and access to data. After doing that, together with Global Integrity, we developed a tool. This tool, we designed it to capture data with these indicators, and were able to make analytics. From the first data set that we analyzed, several issues came up. The next slide. And what we see, and what we saw at that time, which we still see, is that we found that there's generally limited disclosure. Because at AFIC, what we do, yes, we look at the data that is being published vis-a-vis the hard copies. There's still a lot of data within our country that is still published and shared in form of manuals, in form of announcements and different. So it's still both, we are not yet fully 100% into soft data. Most of the data, and actually the accurate data, is in hard copy. So we realize that much of the data, we can access huge amounts of data on the government procurement portal, but we realize that the biggest percentage, which was up to 85%, for example, was never disclosed after doing the analytics. We also realized that actually there is no competition after looking at the different companies winning contracts, the companies that are international or are local, looking at having a gender lens and looking at women-owned vis-a-vis men-owned. We realized that competition was very limited. We also saw and still see that over 70% of the contracts are still executed beyond their contractual period. And then the cost overruns were up to 75%. 75% of the contracts in Uganda have to have budget revisions. There are also tendencies of fraud and collusion. From the data that we analyzed, actually one contract, one bid has different bidders, but when you look deeply at and critically at the data that is provided, you find that actually this bidder, the different bidders have the same for example, and their bids were actually submitted at the same time.
Charity, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Maybe would you mind turning off your video perhaps, because I think it might improve the sound. I can't hear you very well. So maybe if you turn off the video, then.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, yeah, it's much clearer. Thank you.
Okay, so another issue that we saw and still see is that there was limited competition. We saw that all the time there were same or similar companies that were winning and bidding over time in the same sectors, same companies and same bidders were winning and bidding for different contracts. The next slide. This is an example of an analytic that was drawn from the tool that we're using with Global Integrity that illustrates how much data is being actually not disclosed in Uganda. You realize that, for example, in 2015, 2016, the national budget on paper was published was recorded to be 14.86 trillion, but the actual disclosed data was just 0.83 trillion. This is in shillings. So you realize that much as government is disclosing by making these public announcements, by putting these in books, but what is put out to the public through the different portals that have created is actually much less. Oliver, the next slide. Okay, if I continue, so we have continued to make these analytics. We have continued to make the different, identify different cases, but one of the things that we did even before we designed or agreed on the specific indicators to track, we had a stakeholder mapping and come up with use cases. During this meeting, we realized that actually different stakeholder data needs. For example, you will find that civil society is interested in data, using it for anti-corruption and monitoring government expenditure. You find that the private sector is interested in accessing government data for business purposes. And then students and the academia are interested in accessing public data for academic and research. And so this also gave us a lesson, and it gave us an idea to actually the data that is being disclosed, as the first mentioned, is in huge quantities. There is a risk of this data accurate. It's also the risk of, if you're really careful and not understanding, you are likely to track a lot of data, but you are likely to make so many mistakes if not very accurate. So there is that risk, because
Charity, I'm sorry, we can't hear you very well. You're breaking off, Charity.
Okay, I'm breaking.
Yes, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I think now let's try. But I guess we will have to move to the discussion in a minute. So maybe, but I'll just share the slides again. So you can conclude. Okay. Yes, Charity, if the floor is yours, if you'd just like to conclude, so we have it.
Yeah. So from this, we have learned that actually, once you have this data, it has the highest potential to fight corruption. Yes. Yeah. So we have and we have also learned that the citizens and the data users are actually willing to use this data, and once governments are provided feedback, they will actually take it up and find means of working on these issues that are being identified.
All right.
You can hear me?
Yeah. Yes, somewhat. Not quite as clearly as in the beginning, unfortunately.
Okay.
But thank you very much, Charity, for those insights from Uganda. Very good to see how this data is being used in practice. So I'd suggest that we now open the floor for questions from the audience. Please feel free to either raise your hand or put questions in the chat. Are there any questions for any of our speakers? I see that we've got also Dr. Angela May from UNODC, so I don't know if Angela, you'd be able also to share any insights on how all of this relates to the work of UNODC in this field. But maybe I can start perhaps with initial questions in terms of the data. Oh, Angela. Did you want to take the floor?
Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, yeah, we can. Yes.
Yes. Sorry, apology. I'm not. I'm actually at the hospital with my mom, so but I followed, and it's very interesting. I really wanted to follow it because we are really working to indeed understand how data and statistics that can improve anti-corruption policies. So it has been really interesting. I would have a question, maybe if you can comment. Because what we are trying to do is to think about how to develop national system of data and statistics, and then how we can embed, these systems into the, anti-corruption agencies or national statistical offices, etc. So, what would be the tips that you would give to a country to say how to develop this national statistical system? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. Who would like to?
May I jump in on this, because this is something which interests me for some time. And thank you very much, Angela, for joining us even from the hospital, and then good to see you again. So I think a key aspect here is that we are talking about a lot of different data sets in public procurement, in company data sets, and then subsidies and grants. So we have a lot. And where I think statistical offices and systems of statistical data play a key role is that a lot of the times these key data sets for public procurement sit in different data silos, have their own standards, often very low standards. And something which statistical offices are good at, among many things, is to establish common, transparent, replicable standards of data content and quality, and make sure that they are followed. And if there is something, you can intervene and you can ask for better quality data fixes. So I think one key step forward in the fight against corruption and using data-driven insights to fight corruption would be to have statistical offices play a far greater role in cataloging the relevant data, quality assuring it, making sure it's consistent over time. An average procurement law in the countries we have looked at changes 1 to 2 times a year. So you can imagine how the data quality changes in just a couple of years' time. So this requires a lot of effort and expertise. And this is where I think statistical offices can come in. Thank you.
Absolutely. If I may jump in here?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, I totally agree with what's been said by Mishi. And to add to that, I would also say maybe there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So I recommend that you look at existing data standards. And one of the things like a statistical office can do, and this is again shift in how you think about public procurement, is to understand that data probably exists fragmented, and then you need to bring it together so that it can be followed from the planning stage all the way to the implementation and final payments and the checking of the milestones and the quality assurance. And to do that in a lot of countries, they once again they struggle because typically there's no unique ID for a contracting process which you can use to link data up. And I believe that Michi's team also actually has to come up with their own way of making the links in a lot of cases where such a unique ID does not exist. And to do that, I mean, you can look at what Michi's team is doing, and also what I covered in my presentation, OCDS as the standard to base on.
Thank you both. Charity, did you want to add anything? Otherwise, there's also a question, I see, for you, Charity, about AFIC. So I'll just read it out in case you haven't seen it in the chat. Murray Locke saying, I see that AFIC has 46 members in 24 countries. What kind of bodies are members? Do they include governments or government departments?
Okay. Thank you so much. First, adding to the question by the lady who asked, actually, using data to fight anti-corruption works. As Ambak, if I mentioned the name well, maybe there's no need to reinvent the wheels. The already tools that have been developed already and can be adapted, and getting support is there, and there are different tools that you can use, the different standards that you can adopt. This is exactly what AFIC did and promoted in Uganda, and made Uganda one of the first African countries to have open data, and we are doing tremendously much better within the region. So AFIC has 24 members. These are civil society organizations who basically promote the right of access to information in Africa, and also have an element of transparency and accountability. Within these members, we promote open contracting, use of open data. The tools that we learn and adopt at AFIC are also promoted within our members, and they apply them. Yeah.
Thank you. So since we have a couple of minutes left, maybe I could also ask a question. I think some of the indicators that were discussed were more kind of macro level indicators of, how much information is missing, things like that. But would you say that on the individual level of contracts, statistics can actually give a reliable estimate of corruption risk, considering that corruption really changes from one case to another, right? So there is no kind of standard type of corruption, but what's your kind of view on whether this works also at the macro level?
Very quickly, and then I pass it on to the other colleagues. So I think people have used red flags on the contract level, and a lot of the red flags Umrebek talked about, or the ones we have done research on, are defined on the contract level, so it can be done. However, what is important to note is that public procurement data sets, and as well as procurement behavior, is very noisy from the perspective of measuring corruption risks. So we have far less trust in the reliability and validity of our measurement on the contract level. The risk indicators start to be a lot more reliable and valid when we aggregate them for an organization over a period and look at changes over time or across differences across organizations. This doesn't mean that it cannot use, and there are indeed procurement authorities and audit bodies which use these red flags to investigate specific contracts. So it can be done, but just bear in mind that probably measurement is more challenging when you want to have something very specific as opposed to a group of contracts taken together in an organization or a region.
Yeah, thank you.
Just to add to that, most of the anti-corruption research focuses on red flags when it comes to public procurement, and there's a reason they're called red flags, because they're simply giving you a flag that you should perhaps look into here. And in our experience, some joint research with Michi also, we find that as the number of red flags that you can attribute to a single contract increases, it is more likely that something is not right there. And this is where you want to flag that contract for further investigation and then take a little bit more qualitative approach and interview the people and find out what's happening and why we're getting these red flags. And that's what I believe the Italian anti-corruption agency is doing. And in a lot of cases, that is usually the practical application of the red flags.
Yeah, no, thank you for clarifying that. Charity, did you want to add anything on this topic of contract level kind of analysis?
Yes, I think it has the potential of actually identifying the anti-corruption tendencies, because actually majorly what we do at AFIC is that we actually follow the contracts and we use this data, and using the red flags of integrity, that's what we do. And most cases, every time we have brought it to the attention of government, there has always been, even when they don't tell us directly, we see things change. We see things being done differently. So which gives us the impression that actually we had identified and we were right to show that actually there is a problem here. And this data helped us identify and bring out this problem.
That's great to hear. So I think we can conclude on this positive and hopeful note. And I would like to just take this opportunity to thank our three speakers again for really interesting presentations. Thanks very much. We'll make this available on our YouTube collection, as I was saying. And I would also like to thank all the participants who dialed in for your interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.